that atheism, and I'm quoting, is not therapy, but restored mental health, meaning that the existence of God is in fact a mental delusion,
right.
That it's actually an imagined deity that suits the circumstances in which you were brought up, or I was brought up, or anybody else here. Actually, the creative order of things points at God. I'm suggesting to you that actually God is a projection ourselves from our own cultural circumstances. Isn't that true?
That is to say, you wouldn't have the view you are espousing right now if you were born in Madagascar. Does that make the view you are espousing right now wrong? No.
In the book, you draw upon the natural order of things. You refer to the regularity of nature, the clue of beauty. Mm-hmm. And you suggest that these things suggest
right.
that there is a creator. I want to suggest to you an alternative, though. Rather than these things pointing us to a creator, isn't it true that the notion of God is simply a projection of our own cultural circumstances? For example, if you were brought up in Pakistan, you might well call yourself a Muslim, as my parents were. If you were brought up in India, you might call yourself a Hindu or a Sikh. Mm-hmm. These are projections out of the natural culture in which people live. In your book, you're saying, well,
well then, no, and here's the reason why. If somebody says to me, if you were born in Madagascar, you wouldn't even be a Christian, which is basically what you just said. Therefore, how can you say that your position has, Christianity has more validity than any other position? But I could turn to the person and say, if you were born in Madagascar, you wouldn't be a religious relativist. That is to say, you wouldn't have the view you are espousing right now if you were born in Madagascar. Does that make the view you are espousing right now wrong? No. In other words, what you propose proves too much, and it reminds me of Peter Berger. Peter Berger, in his book, Sacred Canopy, it might have been Rumor of Angels. In his book, Rumor of Angels, he has a chapter called Relativizing the Relativizers.
Was your book properly proofread?
No.
Okay, keep going.
If I had the book, I know it was properly proofread. Peter Berger says in Relativizing the Relativizers what you actually just said. He said he was one of the founders of the Sociology of Knowledge school. And the Sociology of Knowledge says, largely, we believe what we believe because of our social plausibility structures. That is, we're surrounded by people who also we admire and we need, and they all believe this, and therefore that makes that belief plausible.
Well, and also there's the transmission of knowledge through generations in a similar social circumstance.
Right. Now, here's what he says then. He says, once you decide that all beliefs are to a great degree socially constructed, you have to realize that that belief must be not immune to what you just said. That is, that belief must be to a great degree socially constructed. I'm an academic, he was saying. I live in a certain milieu. I've got all kinds of other people that I admire and respect. So he says, as soon as you realize that the idea that all views are relative, would also be relative, that all views are socially constructed is also socially constructed, we're back to square one. We're chastened. We now know, of course, yes, we've got to be careful. It's hard to find the truth, but the fact is we're back to square one. We still have to decide which of all these competing claims is more reasonable than any other. And so we may not be as haughty now, but we still have to make that decision. And you can't say, because I was raised in a particular culture, that therefore all things are relative. That very view, of course, would be relative, and therefore back to square one.
You'll know the writer Michael Onfray, in his book The Atheist Manifesto, he argues that atheism, and I'm quoting, is not therapy, but restored mental health, meaning that the existence of God is in fact a mental delusion,
right.
That it's actually an imagined deity that suits the circumstances in which you were brought up, or I was brought up, or anybody else here. And you're saying, if I understand you correctly, that even that position itself is colored by the culture in which it's being expressed.
Well, I think Peter Berger would say that that man has to recognize the social support that he's getting for that view. I'd get one of the problems, of course, with with that kind of statement is that if you believe in God, there's a mental defect. What do you have to say to that believer in God? And the answer is, how would I know if I'm mentally defective?
No, but but in all seriousness, the point Michael Onfray is making is that atheism is actually an intellectually and psychologically clearer position to be in, and a healthier position, because you're not projecting some kind of image of God out of your own circumstances into your head, into the heavenly place, or wherever you imagine him to be.
Well, let's see. Two responses, and I don't know how adequate everybody will think they are. Paul Vitz, who used to teach at NYU, I believe he's retired now, said, in one of his books, he said, the idea that people need to believe in God, they have a psychological need to believe in God, always works another way, and that is, there surely are people who psychologically need not to believe in God. There's all kinds of reasons why people don't want there to be a God. And Thomas Nagel at NYU wrote a book, he's a great philosopher, he wrote a book called The Last Word, in which he admitted, he says, I don't want there to be a God. He says, I am coming right out of the closet and admitting that though I try my best to be objective, I've got all kinds of personal reasons why I wouldn't want that to be true. And I want to be able to make my own decisions. I don't want to have to submit. And so Paul Vitz's whole point is anyone who says those who believe in God need to believe psychologically have to be willing to turn the scalpel on themselves and say, surely there could be reasons that you would have psychologically for not wanting it to be true too.
This argument suggests that humans create God in their own image, shaped by their upbringing, environment, and societal influences. In other words, belief in God is not rooted in objective reality, but is merely a psychological projection of human desires, fears, and norms. This is reminiscent of Feuerbach's and Freud's critiques of religion, where God is imagined as a wish-fulfillment figure, or an idealized father. But as Tim Keller wisely points out, this argument is self-defeating. If belief in God is just culturally conditioned, then so is atheism. If we say, you only believe in God because you were raised in a religious society, the same logic applies. You only disbelieve because you were raised in a secular or skeptical environment. The sword cuts both ways. Cultural influence doesn't determine truth, it just shapes our initial exposure. What matters is whether belief is true, not whether it is common in a culture. This view, often popularized by Richard Dawkins and others, frames religious belief as a form of delusion or mental disorder, and atheism as a kind of psychological awakening or freedom. The claim is that belief in God is irrational, a comforting illusion from which enlightened minds eventually escape. However, this too is a culturally loaded claim. It assumes naturalism as a default without proving it. But even deeper, if our brains are just the result of unguided evolution, why trust their reasoning faculties at all? As C.S. Lewis argued, if thought is merely the outcome of atomic motion, rational thought itself becomes unreliable, including the thought that God is a delusion. In sum, both belief and disbelief are shaped by culture, but truth transcends culture. The Bible affirms in Romans 1 verses 19 to 20 that God's reality is evident through creation itself, so that we are without excuse. And in John 7 verse 17, Jesus says, if anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God. Books for further reading. The Reason for God by Tim Keller. Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. God's Undertaker. Has Science Buried God? By John Lennox. Faith and Culture by Kelly Monroe Kohlberg. Can Man Live Without God? By Ravi Zacharias. God is not a projection of man, man is the image of God. And when we seek truth, we don't find a cultural echo, we find a risen Christ.